Hi, I'm Stephen Carson from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Um, Thought I was going to have Ryan with me tonight, but he had a last minute obligation and is not able to join me. So I might stumble along a little, but bear with me. Okay, first of all, I want to share that for the Old Glory Club, of which I am currently the president, a group of Americans who met at a U.S. event earlier this year, and we've formed a group that we have interesting plans for. I think you'll find. So please follow us. Follow Old Glory Club on YouTube, and what I want to call your attention to is on Substack. This week, on for our Monday article, we do a Monday article, Wednesday article, and a Friday video, typically. Um, I published "Evil is Real." It's some thoughts I shared informally at the US event and have been kind of talking about now and again, but finally wrote them up. It's not very long. I'd appreciate you giving it a glance and subscribing to the Old Glory Club Substack. I think you'll like what we're doing there. Um, Wanted to ask the chat to give me some feedback. Someone on Twitter said, I'm pretty sure YouTube has been hiding your videos, even in my subscriptions feed. I'm never sure what to think when people say that, because it could just be being confused by the interface or something like that. But would be curious for feedback if anyone feels like my stuff's being suppressed. Having said that, I don't know if there's anything to do about it. I mean, I would just know that, I guess. Also, I would like to promote our book cover competition. The deadline is end of next week, I believe. And I would love for there to be some more entries. There are some good entries already, some fun ones. What you do is you go to the video description of this video. You'll see a link to our Discord. Join that Discord and go to the book cover competition, I think it's called, channel. And I just pointed to the rules there, so you can take a look at the rules. You can take a look at some of the other entrants. We'll have that deadline end of next week, and then usually between Christmas and New Year's, we have a special show to go through the entries and give real hard money prizes to the winners. Okay. That's all that. Oh, and financial support is really appreciated at our public Bitcoin wallet or at Subscribestar, which is all in the video description. Okay, so it's just going to be me on the screen talking to you, but I think this is pretty interesting. In reading about this, I ended up finding a slightly personal connection that surprised me, or one that had never occurred to me before, I guess, shall we say, which I'll mention later. But okay, so 1968. We're going to start the story there with a man who went by the name Sam Melville, though he had been born Samuel Grossman in the Bronx in 1934. He had gotten involved in radical politics in 1968, quitting his job to work for a radical newspaper called The Guardian in New York, not to be confused with the UK Guardian. He met a young woman named Jane Alpert, while selling subscriptions to The Guardian. And they both were excited by radical politics. Radical politics seems to be a code word for left-wing politics. But anyway, talk was not enough for him, though. Jane quickly found out he wanted action. And first thing that happened is that he helped hide two FLQ terrorists from Quebec. I'm not going to try to pronounce the proper what FLQ stands for. But they had been doing some bombings in Quebec. He helped hide them. While he hid them and brought them food in New York, he asked lots of questions about what it was like to do, terrorist operations, basically, to hide, to conceal your identity, all the logistics of pulling this sort of stuff off. And then he helped them plan to hijack a plane to Cuba, which they successfully did. This excited him and propelled him to the next level, which is that he and some others successfully robbed a dynamite warehouse. The funny part about that is that he didn't know that you could just go buy dynamite at like a hardware store back in those days. Um, but anyway, he was excited by that. He and Jane were excited about that. So then Jane and he were having relationship troubles or something, and he thought they were gonna like see other people now and stuff like this, but we're still living together. And then she decides she's supposed to go on a date with somebody. She comes back and he's sitting there, and he's like, "I thought you're supposed to be on a date." She says, "I wanted to be with you." And then she's like, "What's going on? Something's feeling different." He said, "I planted a bomb today." He had planted a bomb at Marine Midland Bank near Wall Street. Um, I'll tell you more about that in just a moment, but more on Sam. The first bombs in 1968 had already exploded in America, scores of them, and self-styled revolutionaries. I'm reading from Days of Rage by Brian Burrow. Self-styled revolutionaries were already as thick as the air that sweltering August night, August 1969. But the man who really started it all, who became a kind of patient zero for the underground groups of the 1970s, was Sam Melville. Until he and his friends began planting bombs around Manhattan in the summer of 1969, protest bombings had been mostly limited to college campuses, typically Molotov cocktails heaved toward ROTC buildings late at night. All but forgotten a day, Melville was the first to take anti-government violence to a new level, building large bombs and using them to attack symbols of American power. While later groups would augment his tactics with bank robbery, kidnapping, and murder, Melville's remained the essential blueprint for almost every radical organization of the next decade. So she comes in, finds out that he's planted a bomb, and she says, "Did you people work there at night? You know, did you call to make sure they clear the building?" And he's like, "No, you got to call, you know." So she calls, talks to a security guard, and I think the security guard blew her off. And this is what happened. Melville had simply wandered into the building earlier that day and left the bomb next to an elevator on the 8th floor. This is at the Marine Midland Bank. That night, about 50 people, almost all women, were working on the floor and putting data into bookkeeping machines. When the bomb went off at 10:45 p.m., the explosion destroyed several walls, blowing an 8-foot hole in the floor and dumping a ton of debris down into the 7th floor, where more people were working. Windows shattered, generating a blizzard of flying glass. Several women's dresses were cut to shreds. Sirens echoed through lower Manhattan. Ambulances carted away 20 people who had been injured, none of them seriously. Alpert, by the way, was angry. Jane Alpert was angry because of Sam's motivations. She felt that this had nothing to do with the war or Nixon or racism. She knew Melville well, and she knew that this had been about her. As she wrote years later, "Because I had threatened to abandon him for even one night by sleeping with another man, he had taken revenge on a skyscraper full of people." This is a theme I noticed reading through this book, the first half of this book. We'll do the second half another time. That violence and, how do I put it, sexual revolutionary kind of sex, you know. Sexual revolution and violence are all sort of intermixed throughout all this. Keeps coming up over and over, a theme I noticed going through this. So then Sam Melville and some of his friends bombed something called the Federal Building. Each time they would deliver a communique to newspapers to explain their political reasons for doing this. This was a common pattern. You'd send your communique out before or after the bombing to let people know like what this was supposed to mean, you know, right? Because it's a it's a terrorist action, right? They're not just like targeting something to. In fact, most of these bombings that seem to happen didn't seem to have any real tactical impact. Like It didn't like stop the Vietnam War because they bombed a certain building or something. It was meant to raise consciousness. You know, it was meant to be a public spectacle to get people's attention, um, and to radicalize people, I guess, to express anger at what was happening. Um, One of the last bombings, the very last day of this bombing campaign by Sam Melville, he was involved with was the criminal courts building where the so-called Panther 21 were on trial for alleged conspiracy to kill New York policemen. You probably guessed it, the Panther 21 were a group of Black Panthers. And their trial became a sort of cause celebre among the left-wing radicals. You know, people were supporting them, supporting the accused, and saying that they were just, you know, being treated this way because the system was racist or something. I don't know what, or just maybe because they thought that what they were doing was fine, and they wanted to support them in it. But that's noteworthy, that connection to the Black Panthers. We will come back to that. That very day, he had been intending to leave that the next morning, I think, for another part of the United States, to leave New York, and he wanted to go out with a bang. So that criminal courts building bombing happened, and then he went off to do one more. But the FBI had been watching him. They missed him with the criminal courts building bombing, but they had an informant and knew what he one of a couple possibilities of what he'd be targeting secondly that day, and they caught him, and you know, the bombs were on a timer, and they were able to defuse the bombs. He was arrested and sent to prison. Jane Alpert was arrested also, but didn't end up with prison time. Sam Melville, just to finish up his story, died during a prison rebellion at Attica. I didn't look it up, but I wonder if this is the famous prison rebellion that is well known and was referenced in that movie. Anyway, the one where he's saying Attica, Attica. I'm forgetting the name of the movie. But which was also a reference to that prison rebellion. Anyway, he died during a prison rebellion at Attica, so he, you know, was this patient zero, this one who kind of got things going, but did not continue to be in this radical terrorist, left-wing terrorist scene. Jane Alpert, on the other hand, went underground. And that is a theme throughout this book, that when it was time to get serious with their actions, they always talk about taking an action. And action means, you know, we're not going to just talk. We're going to blow something up. We're going to kill someone. We're going to take an action, right? And I think it's also meant to evoke, like, they fancy themselves to be sort of like taking military actions with these things they were doing. And so back to this connection to, well, okay, I'll tell you in a moment. So here's one of the biggest misconceptions that Brian Burrow clears up right away, which is what this violence, this terrorist, left-wing terrorist violence was about. And he says, yeah, and he says, if you mention about the armed resistance movement that sprang up in the months after My Lai, the Manson family, and Woodstock, the most common response is something along the lines of, oh, wasn't that a bunch of hippies protesting the Vietnam War during the 60s? This couldn't be more wrong, Burroughs says. The radicals of this new underground weren't hippies. They weren't primarily interested in the war. And it wasn't the 1960s. Now, we started in the summer of 1969 because he sort of set the template. But the bulk of the story that we're going to tell in this and another video is all primarily during the 70s. A little bit bleeds into the 80s, but it's primarily during the 1970s. As I mentioned in the marketing, 1900 domestic bombings in the United States in 1972. I mean, I was alive at this time. It just blows my mind that I didn't know about this. Anyway, so, right, and it wasn't the war. The first true protest bombing campaign by Sam Melville's group that I just went through didn't arrive until mid 1969, and headline bombings didn't become widespread until 1970, as we'll see shortly. And while Melville and his peers who embraced the counterculture, and you especially see that later with like the Weather Underground, they sort of embrace it tactically, though. The activists themselves were the furthest thing from hippies who tended toward hedonism and pacifism. But these young radicals who engaged in bombings and the assassination of policemen during the 70s and early 80s were, for the most part, deadly serious, hardcore leftists. Okay. As an example, members of the Black Liberation Army, which we'll talk about later, read Mao as part of their mandatory daily political education classes. So these weren't just sort of, I don't like the war, man. They were indoctrinated Marxists, who indoctrinated people who came into their ranks. An even more prevalent myth, however, you already said that. Anyway, is that the radical violence that commenced in 1970 was a protest against the Vietnam War. Now, the members of the underground were anti-war. The war itself was seldom their primary focus. I did not know this. He says, we related to the war in a purely opportunistic way. Howard Machtinger, one of the Weather Underground's early leaders, says, we were happy to draw new members who were anti-war, but this was never about the war. So what was it about? What the underground movement was truly about, what it was always about, was the plight of Black Americans. Every single underground group of the 1970s, with the notable exception of the Puerto Rican FALN, was concerned first and foremost with the struggle of blacks against police brutality, racism, and government repression. So, I'll read one more quote. Machtinger says, helping out the blacks, fighting alongside them, that was the whole kit and caboodle. That was all we were about. Race comes first, always first, says Elizabeth Fink, a radical attorney in Brooklyn who presented scores of underground figures. Everything started with the Black Panthers. Okay, so what's happening here? The turn that I think some of us think about a lot, right? Which is we call it the turn towards culture, cultural Marxism, though that's now a forbidden term, I guess. It's a no-no term to say cultural Marxism. But anyway, whatever you want to call it, originally the Marxists, of course, were focused on, an uprising of the working class. Now, we covered this in the last episode of the this turn in the last episode, where we talked about how basically they just got nowhere with the American working class. One of the schools that, was associated with trained Rosa Parks and was associated with Martin Luther King, or Martin Luther King spoke there. Again, see our last episode on this in the series. They were originally focused on getting the miners in like West Virginia to rise up, or something like that, and it just didn't go anywhere. And so they were looking for some other way to like get the revolution going, right? And so they turned to racial politics. So this is what a lot of people talk about, even to this day. Like one of my favorite leftists, anti-war leftist, Caitlin Johnston, she wants it to be like classical Marxism again, right? Old-fashioned class stuff, and she doesn't. Sometimes there'll be old-fashioned Marxists who will be angry about the fact that the focus is now on racial minorities, feminism, trans rights. That's been the turn, but we're talking here 1969, 1970. The left-wing radicals are already focused on race, right? So this is a long time ago. That's over 50 years ago. And our story last time was even older than that. So this turn from, at least in the United States, this turn from the left-wing the revolutionary focus being on the workers, the proletariat or whatever, to the a racial minority or some other sort of cultural identity group. This is an old story. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's become even more forward in recent times that this is what they're all about, right? But it's not new. It's not new. The group that they, what I like to call the stalking horse that they hide behind, with their perpetual goal being the same, right? Underneath, the stalking horse tends to change. It's Black Americans at one point. It's the women being oppressed at another point. It's you know LGBT and then LGBT and and it'll be something tomorrow, something else tomorrow, right? But the basic pattern has been the same for a long time now, which is that they no longer stick with the Marxist focus on class analysis, and now they're looking to some other kind of oppressed identity group of some sort to use to be sort of a vanguard or in my view, a thing they hide behind for their real goals. By the way, in my view, you don't want to be the stalking horse. It doesn't tend to go well for the stalking horse as we look at history. Okay, so what we're going to learn about then is left-wing terrorist action, violence primarily in the 1970s, driven by the with a focus on like the rights of Black Americans. Okay, so back to the Black Panthers. I'll continue with this quote from Elizabeth Fink. It captures it well. Race comes first, always first. Everything started with the Black Panthers, the whole thrill of being with them. When you heard Huey Newton, you were blown away. The civil rights movement had turned bad, and these people were ready to fight. And yeah, the war. The country was turning into Nazi Germany. That's how we saw it. But note the boomer truth here. Do you have the guts to stand up? The underground did. And oh, the glamour of it. The glamour of dealing with the underground. They were my heroes. Stupid me. It was the revolution, baby. We were going to make a revolution. We were so deluded. Okay, what does she mean by deluded? Because we need to enter into their delusion, so to speak, a little bit to understand the mindset that brought about some of the violence. They had convinced themselves that they were like on the verge. The United States was on the verge of a like a Marxist revolution, basically. Overthrow the government and put a left-wingers in power, right? And all it needed was a spark. In fact, this is not covered by the book, but just one of my favorite obscure facts that people don't remember. Charles Manson was motivated by this and the crimes that he had his family commit. He wanted to start a race war so that Black Americans would be politically activated and would overthrow their oppressors. So he was also, like these people, he was also motivated in the same way by, revolutionary politics focused on Black Americans. And so he actually, you might recall, in the crimes that his family did, they killed white people, famous white people, right? Famous, rich, prominent white people. And, they wanted something that would be noticed, right? But their intention was, when they did the crime, they meant to make it look like Black people had done it, so that white people would follow me here. This is Charles Manson we're talking about. White people would get mad that Black people had done this, would attack Black people, and then Black people would fight back, and the race war would be on, which was an end devoutly to be wished from a Charles Manson point of view, but not just his point of view, this point of view as well, right? So that's the delusion she's talking about. They're thinking that they just need to do, just one more thing, and then it's going to get on, right? The Revolutionary War, so to speak, is going to be happening. and I think why she refers from a vantage point of later of saying diluted is, I think eventually they realized that the revolution was not going to happen in the United States. It was nowhere close, and they were just participating in meaningless destruction. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, he goes through a bit of the story that we had told last time about the rise of the civil rights movement and how there was disagreement about how much a nonviolent tactic should be used as opposed to violence. And of course, most famously, the Black Panthers were the ones who, well, officially stood for just self-defense. You know, we will use violence in defense of ourselves, our communities, our families. But as we'll see later, some Black Panthers decided to take it in a more radical direction. And so, given that that was their motivation, was the bad treatment of Black Americans, who were the targets? He says, it was no accident when underground groups began forming in 1970 and 1971. Their targets were rarely slumlords. That'd be like the Marxist, classical Marxist viewpoint, right? Let's stop the capitalist oppressors or whatever. Or army barracks. That'd be the anti-war angle. Or politicians. They were almost always policemen. Okay, I'll wait to comment on that. So, Malcolm X talked a more radical game and was a big inspiration to a number of these groups. And then Stokely Carmichael, and I'm not wanting to get too much into the Black Power thing. Just wanted to make it clear that that is the these are the things happening before this. In the 67, 68, 69, things are getting increasingly radical with, Black Black radical activists. Right. So what happened is that the white, often, as you'll notice, Jewish political activists had that, veneration of the oppressed or veneration of the minority that is, such a common thing we see with left-wingers, right? And so as you heard it in that lawyer's words, they had this big admiration for the Black radicals. And they just kind of wanted to be them, even though they couldn't be them, right? Because they weren't Black. But they wanted to be allies to them, if nothing else. And so that brings us to the first serious group that really got it going in the 70s, and that's the Weathermen. So the Weathermen, which eventually became known as the Weather Underground Organization. By the way, I haven't been able to find a really good color version of it, but supposedly their logo was a neon rainbow. So anyway, yeah, here's a Weatherman editorial from December 1969. So this is all going on around that time that Sam Melville is doing that. The Weathermen are emerging out of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, a 60s era protest group. Anyway, from a Weatherman editorial in December 1969, Pig America, America spelled with a K, Pig America, beware. There's an army growing right in your guts, and it's going to bring you down. Okay, so he says there's a number of things about the Weathermen's multi-year bombing campaign that have been misunderstood in fundamental ways. To cite just one canard, for much of its life, Weathermen's attacks were the work not of 100 or more underground radicals, as was widely assumed, but of a core group of barely a dozen people. Almost all its bombs, in fact, were built by the same capable man, its bomb guru. Um, Now, we have to be careful here. That doesn't mean that like there were just 12 crazy people and otherwise nothing else was going on. Yes, there was a small, tight group that was doing these bombings for the Weather Underground, but they had a lot of support of people who were above ground, right? Who weren't hiding, and that's why they were able to keep hiding. They'd move among the apartments of friends and stuff like that, and they'd get funds from people who work jobs and stuff. Um, Nor, contrary to myth, I would call this romanticization, did Weatherman's leaders, especially its best known alumni, Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, operate from grinding poverty or ghetto anonymity. For much of their time underground, Dorn and Ayers lived in a cozy California beach bungalow, while the group's East Coast leaders lived in a comfortable vacation rental in New York's Catskill Mountains. Um, of far greater significance is widespread confusion over what Weatherman set out to do. Its alumni have crafted an image of the group as benign, urban guerrillas who never intended to hurt a soul. Their only goal to damage symbols of American power, empty courthouses and university buildings, a Pentagon bathroom, the U.S. Capitol. Yes, there was an attack on the Capitol before January 6th. You might not have heard of it, but you will here. This is what Weatherman eventually became. That is, the just symbolic things. But it began as something else, something murderous, and it had to soften its tactics only after they proved unsustainable. So, they were seeing themselves in military terms, right? And killing people was not was something that was one of the options, right? Okay. So, interestingly, related to my friend's book, it just happens to be right here, The Populist Delusion. Oop, there we go. One of his big points is that people marching around in the streets have never really caused political change. Well, believe it or not, they figured that out. And that's part of why we ended up with the left wing. That's why they ended up going in this direction of left wing terrorism, because protests alone they could see were no longer enough. And here's how an SDSer named Dotson Rader put it: the meaninglessness of nonviolent, democratic, in scare quotes, democratic methods was becoming clear to us in the spring of 1967. The civil rights movement was dead. Pacifism was dead. Some leftists, the Trotskyites, Maoists, radical socialists, some of the radicals in SDS, Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, Tom Hayden, they knew it early. But it took the rest of us a while to give up the sweet life of the democratic left for revolt. So these are people who are, what's the term? Social democrats, right? Just to make sure you understand this distinction. A big divide throughout the 20th century and even before was between people who would be sort of orthodox Marxists in regards to revolution. That is, revolution is going to come about through like a violent overturning, right? Violent, radical, revolutionary action. Some people turned from that and said, no, we can use democracy to achieve this. We don't have to blow anything up. We don't have to shoot people. We can basically vote our way into power. It still seems to me that the Social Democrats are the most dangerous, but because they've basically taken everything over at this point, if you haven't noticed. But that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a disagreement over tactics. And the original thing was, to some degree, though we shared last time how that was even false back in the civil rights movement, but to some degree there were people, some of them, who believed that they had the populist delusion, right? They believed that we'll march around in the streets, people will see the justice of our cause, and magic happens here, right? And change somehow happens. But eventually they're figuring out what AA explains to us in the populist delusion, that change actually never happens that way. And so they start becoming more radical. Well, what does more radical really mean in this context? It means going back to being more fundamentalist, you might say, going back to the fundamentals, going back to Marx and saying, okay, we thought we could try this other route. It's not working. We got to be violent revolutionaries. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Here's an early sign of where this was going. It was Greg Calvert once who put it first into words, at least publicly, in a front page article in the New York Times in May 1967. The article, which attempted to take stock of student resistance activities, suggested that violence was the movement's logical next step, a contention it supported with a quote that Calvert quickly recanted. Quote, "We are working to build a guerrilla force in an urban environment." So at the time in 67, they all kind of backed off. We're like, no, we're not serious about that. But in fact, that was where they were going. And it seems to me it was sort of an inevitable logic. If they were going to keep pushing for this change and the democratic way wasn't going to work, well, what does that leave you? It like leaves you no other option, right? So I don't think this was all like a big mass conspiracy necessarily. It's just the logic of it all led them, different groupings, different individuals, it all led them to conclude violence is the only answer left. Okay. So Students for Democratic Society, who had been key for these sort of, the democratic way, right? The social democrat way, peaceful change and marching around and stuff like that. It says that SDS's leadership happened to be populated by an outsized number of Jewish students. And for many of these, the notion of challenging a US government they imagined as the second coming of Nazi Germany had enormous appeal. So I think this is interesting because one of the things that my friend Academic Agent has been emphasizing is what he calls the boomer truth regime. That, what is good is, kind of the 60s ideal, right? Free love and be who you want to be and create yourself and all, ultimate individualism kind of sort of unconstrained self-expression is the ultimate good, and the ultimate evil is the mid-century Germans, right? And so these are people who are seeing the world that way. The United States is basically becoming, they're more or less Nazis at this point. So, time to push back. Okay. Oh, I said that whole piece and I forgot Kirkpatrick Sale, an interesting figure for other reasons. He wrote the definitive history of the SDS, SDS, the rise and development of the Students for a Democratic Society. And he notes that this turn towards radical violence was the inevitable result of everything that had happened at that point in the 1960s. Bear with me as I read a slightly lengthy quote because this is really helpful in kind of getting our heads into the space that's going on back there. Revolution. How had it come to that? It was a blend of many things: bitterness, hatred, and alienation, hope, confidence, and conviction, energy, passion, and need. It was the pattern woven by all the threads of the 60s, the inevitable product of the awakened generation as it probed deeper and deeper into the character of its nation. There was a primary sense, begun by no more than a reading of the morning papers and developed through the new perspectives and new analyses available to the movement now, that the evils in America were the evils of America, inextricably a part of the total system. Clearly, something drastic would be necessary to eradicate those evils and alter that system. Various reforms had been tried. Confrontation had been tried. There had been civil rights agitation, university pressures, anti-war marches, doorbell ringing, electoral action, student power, draft resistance demonstrations, campus uprisings, and even tentative political violence, all to little avail. So what's he saying there, right? We tried the populist methods. We tried the democratic populist methods, people power and all that stuff, and it didn't work, right? Worse, those who wanted peaceable change, who tried to work through approved channels, seemed to be systematically ignored, ostracized, or, as with the Kennedys and King, eliminated. more was necessary. And in the words of one SDS leader, what it came to that year was that people came to the conclusion that the only way to stop the war was make a revolution, and the only way to stop racism was to make a revolution. The monster, that was the recurrent phrase now, could not be altered, deviated, halted. It had to be destroyed. So you see what's happening here, right? It's a transition um, to from the peaceful means of change to violence, and it's a transition from a sort of reformist view. We can reform this system towards what we want it to be, to a more thoroughgoing critique. No, it can't be reformed. It has to be destroyed. We can't fix it iteratively, fix it towards what we need it to be. We just have to tear it down and start over. Okay, now I skipped something I meant to say here. Oh yeah, here we go. This turn spread really quickly. So in the summer, so remember that Greg Calvert, he said in the New York Times, quoted in the New York Times, we were working to build a guerrilla force in an urban environment, and everybody backed off. 1967, Summer of Love, blah, blah, blah. But then in the summer of 1968, 1 year later, a study found that more than 350,000 young Americans considered themselves revolutionaries. Now, what did that mean in a lot of cases? I don't know. But still, the temper and the tone had changed, right? Okay. A favorite movie, and I've seen this, and I recommend it to you. A favorite movie of the apocalyptic revolutionaries was The Battle of Algiers. It is an excellent movie. I strongly recommend it to people who are interested in, well, all kinds of reasons to watch it. It's a 1966 film that portrayed heroic Algerian guerrillas doing battle against their French occupiers. And once people actually began going underground, their Bible would become the mini manual of the urban guerrilla, written in 1969 by a Brazilian Marxist named Carlos Marighella. It outlined dozens of strategies and tactics, analyzing weapons, outlining ways to organize a guerrilla cell, even describing the best ways to rob a bank. And then again, back to this delusion they had. We actually believed there was going to be a revolution, remembers a weatherman. We believed the world was undergoing a massive transformation. We believed third world countries would rise up and cause crises that would bring down the industrialized West. And we believed it was going to happen tomorrow, or maybe the day after tomorrow, like 1976. We really thought that would happen. I know I did. So that's the part where the other lady was saying we were so deluded. In other words, we thought it was just right on the edge, just needed a nudge, Okay. Okay, now let's start introducing some of these characters. I don't think I may not even get through talking about the weatherman, but that's okay. I think this history just blew my mind. Okay. Right. Okay. So one of the big things that happened, there was a spark that kind of kicked things off here at Columbia University in New York. By the way, it just so happens, if I remember correctly, that Murray Rothbard went to Columbia University. I think he got his PhD from there. Before this, he was older, right? So it would have been before that. But anyway, April 1968, the SDS chapter's action faction grew outraged the segregation of a proposed gymnasium and the university's ties to a Pentagon-sponsored think tank. After peaceful protests, they occupied Hamilton Hall, the administration building at Columbia, and they refused to leave until the gym was scrapped and ties to the think tank were severed. When an administrator went to meet them, they took him hostage and barricaded in his office. Police surrounded the building, but they didn't want to storm it because they were worried about inflaming adjoining black neighborhoods. And so a kind of siege ensued, with the occupying students using bullhorns to harangue crowds of the curious. This must have been bizarre. I don't know if there's footage of this. I wish there was. Okay, the author notes, had all this happened in San Diego, it might have been dismissed as a random instance of especially aggressive student protesters, because there'd been student protests throughout the 60s, right? But because it happened in New York, the world's media center, Columbia became an overnight phenomenon, as images of angry shouting students were beamed to television sets around the world. As far as the press was concerned, the star of the show was the student spokesman, a soft, husky, New Jersey sophomore named Mark Rudd, whose dramatic poses, typically one fist raised, the other wrapped around a bullhorn, appeared seemingly everywhere, climaxing with the cover of Newsweek. Anyway, they're pushing an open door, right? Anyway, for mainstream America, Rudd became a dismaying symbol not only of SDS, but of the movement itself. The prototypical nice Jewish boy from the suburbs, transformed into something new and angry by these strange times. Behind the scenes, there was another figure that's going to be very important. Rudd's best friend, a hyper-intense motor-mouthed Connecticut leftist named John Jacobs, and everyone knew him as JJ, and I'll refer to him that way as well. And JJ was quite radical. Where mainstream commentators viewed Columbia as a student protest, JJ told anyone who would listen that it was far, far more. The first step toward a genuine American revolution, concrete evidence that young people working together could bring the country's white elites to their knees. It was JJ who popularized the parallels between Colombia and the Cuban Revolution. They were very taken with Che Guevara. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that, I'm sure. But this started way back then. It wasn't when his face was on t-shirts later. It was way back here. He popularized the parallels between Colombia and the Cuban Revolution. He preached that a select group of hardcore rebels could, as Castro and Guevara had with Cuba, lead America into revolution. One of the friends says, at first everyone thought JJ was crazy, but then events kind of caught up with him, and suddenly what he was saying seemed almost sensible. So in other words, some people were more of a vanguard, right? They were out ahead, talking about how things needed to get radical, and then kind of the mood shifted, and suddenly these guys who sounded crazy seemed visionary, right? Right, and so this is the delusion, by the way, that they can have there can be a revolution in America. Yeah, this came from, in particular, a 1967 book called Revolution in the Revolution by a French philosophy professor named Regis Debray. By the way, if you know anything about mass murder in the 20th century, you would be amazed how many French philosophy professors are in the background somewhere, training the Khmer Rouge leaders, for example, in Paris, before they went and did the horrible things they did in Cambodia. Don't know what's going on with those French philosophy professors, but I think they need to be stopped. Okay, so Debray was a friend of Guevara's who taught in Havana, and he argued that small, fast-moving guerrilla groups, such as those Che commanded, could inspire a grassroots rebellion even in the United States. Debray drew on what leftists called vanguardism, right? The notion that the most politically advanced members of any proletariat could draw the working class into revolution. And this is what JJ got into, and this is what a lot of these radicals came to believe. We just need to be the spark, right? And then everyone will follow behind us. Okay, so now we got to introduce Bernardine Dorn. All right, let me make sure I'm introducing her properly. Yeah, okay, I'm going to read a little to you here because you can't miss out on her. She's a pretty key figure, and anyway, okay. JJ fell in with another up-and-comer, a strikingly attractive 26-year-old law student named Bernardine Dorn. Dorn was destined to become the glamorous leading lady of the American underground, unquestionably brilliant, cool, focused, militant, and highly sexual. When I talk about sexual stuff being a theme, Bernardine Dorn is part of who I have in mind here. J. Edgar Hoover would dub her La Pasionara I'm not saying that right, La Pasionaria of the lunatic left. She'd been a high school cheerleader. She graduated from the University of Chicago in 1963, along with a friend of mine named a late friend of mine named Charles Ford, who talked about being at the University of Chicago with her. That is not the personal connection I was going to reveal, though that's another one. So while she was working toward her law degree, she began assisting a host of protest groups, including SDS. Clad in a tight miniskirt and knee-high Italian boots, she burst onto the scene at Columbia, where she helped arrange bail bonds. You know, she was doing legal stuff there. Everyone who met her, every man at least, seemed mesmerized. One SDSer says, every guy I knew at Columbia, every single one wanted to fuck her. And she liked to wear a button with the slogan, "Cunnilingus is cool, fellatio is fun." So, just so you know, I mean, I won't go on. Well, I won't go on and on, but she uses her sexuality in a very explicit way. She uses it to make things happen politically. Okay, she and JJ were immediately smitten with each other. Bernardine would be arguing political points at the table with blouse open to the navel, sort of leering at JJ. I couldn't concentrate on the arguments. Finally, I said, "Bernardine, would you please button your blouse?" She just pulled out one of her breasts and in that cold way of hers said, "You like this tit? Take it." Another SDSer, Jim Mellon, recalled she used sex to explore and cement political alliances. Sex for her was a form of ideological activity. Yet, even many SDS women idolized Dorn. Everyone wanted to be in her favor, to be like her. A weatherman named Susan Stern said she possessed a splendor all her own, like a queen, a high priestess, a mythological silhouette. So, anyway, introduce some figures really fast there. Rudd, JJ, Bernardine Dorn. These are all key to our story here. Okay, so forgive the little bit of detail there, but need you to picture who these people are. And the way Dorn used sex, which was weird. Anyway. Oh yeah, and just to be clear where these people are coming from, this is useful. So she was elected at the National Convention of SDS in June of '68, and more than a few found her too beautiful to take seriously. You know, she looked like a cheerleader, I guess, or whatever. When one questioner asked whether she was in fact a socialist, Dorn took a moment, looked the man square in the eyes, and memorably replied, "I consider myself a revolutionary communist." So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm seeing Lady of Shalot's comment. These people would be working for Soros now. Well, you know, Bernardine Dorn actually is alive and still active. I looked up one of the people who was kind of a kid and was friends with Dorn when this person was a child. And I looked her up on Twitter, and she's, you know, it's all left-wing politics, like, you know, all the stuff you'd expect, right? You know, the vax and, you know, all the current things. They're still at it all these years. Okay, so I'm not going to introduce every single. There's other figures here. Jim Mellon is significant, but anyway, Washington University in St. Louis, where I went twice. An SDSer was convicted of ROTC facilities were burned there, as well as Delaware, Texas, Berkeley, and Oregon. An SDSer was convicted of arson at WashU, my own WashU. Campus buildings were bombed at Georgetown, the University of Michigan, New York University, and 4 California colleges. And homemade bombing manuals began circulating at SDS meetings and rock concerts. These were all on a smaller scale, I guess, than some of the things we're going to see. Excuse me just a moment. Heather?
Yeah.
Just mute. Sorry, had to make plans for the next, what's happening right after this. Okay, Okay, so this is all 69, right? And these there's this turn towards violence. There's Molotov cocktails being used, ROTC facilities being burned down, um, and uh, this emboldens JJ and Dorn. Um, they had begun to think of so they began to think of themselves as the future of SDS and of the movement. And so they made a manifesto, 16,000 word manifesto, the infamous Weatherman paper. And JJ banged out most of it, and they all reviewed. And when they were done, he and 10 others signed it. So JJ signed it, Dorn signed it, Mark Rudd signed it, Jeff Jones, Howie Machtinger, Jim Mellon, Terry Robbins, key name, and Bill Ayers. Like I said, some of these people are still around and active. And they have positions at universities, and they're celebrated, and they're lionized in the left, right? Okay, so the paper was a lot of Marxist jargon, but the key point is they allied themselves with the third world guerrilla campaign sprouting up around the world. They say we're part of this one big global struggle between oppressed minorities and the agencies of U.S. imperialism. So again, remember, it's not the workers anymore; it's the minorities, those who are oppressed because of their identity, I guess. Mark Rudd was Che's comrade in arms, and it says the genius of JJ's argument was that it allowed white radicals to portray themselves as allies of these oppressed minorities by rallying behind the one group whose leaders, from Martin Luther King to Huey Newton, the JJs of the world adored even more than Che Guevara, American blacks. I think in our hearts, what all of us wanted to be, former SDS leader Kathy Wilkerson recalls, was a Black Panther. Okay, so I think I've set the scene pretty well. I am going to skip a bit because well, let's see. It talks about how they take over the SDS and all this stuff, and that's not very interesting to me. They take it over and they destroy it, basically. It's this big student protest organization, and they take it over and it splits because the way that they take it over. And then one of their early things is they did something called what they called the National Action, and it became known as what gave the book the title, The Days of Rage. And the plan there was they wanted to do a massive protest march planned for October, in which the new, far larger group would make its political debut, storming the streets of Chicago in an all-out attack on the police and symbols of government authority. Okay, so give me a sec here. Yeah, again, this theme keeps coming up, right? Weatherman, the problem was they were not finding much of anyone in the working class who wanted to join the revolution. Oh yeah, so I haven't made totally clear who these people are, right? Most of them, as far as I can tell from reading the book, are Jewish, middle class, college students. They're not all that, but that's predominantly what they are. And people who are not that don't fit in as well. Like working class people don't find this to be a fit for them, this movement. And let's see. Sorry, I'm a little less organized this time. Smash monogamy program. Oh yeah, orgies. Again, the theme of sex. They viewed it as this sort of part of and they did other things along these lines, but they viewed these orgies as part of a breaking down individuality and making them part of a collective. So the idea was to break down the last remaining personal barriers. They don't want boundaries, right? Healthy boundaries. So as Terry Robbins put it, people who fuck together fight together. And so they had a national orgy in Columbus, Ohio during a visit by the leadership. And I won't go into the details, but they all run around having sex with different people, right? But again, the sex is mixed in there with what shortly becomes violence. But that actually didn't last long. Similar to the sexual revolution in Russia I've talked about here, where it just caused too much trouble. Mark Rudd thought all the sexual experimentation, from smash monogamy to orgies to homosexuality. Smash monogamy was they would, like, if there was a couple, they would break the couple up and make them sleep with other people or something. He thought all this sexual experimentation was disastrous, fostering petty jealousies, driving people out of the collectives, and introducing a level of sexual confusion that did little to focus cadres on the revolution. Worst of all, he recalls, was a resulting epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases, from gonorrhea and pelvic inflammatory disease to crab lice and genital infections they called weather crud. For Rudd, the final straw came when he was having sex with a woman and noticed a crab in her eyebrow. Crab lice. So, yuck. Anyway, did I mention that leftists can be a little bit dirty? They're just, disgusting. Okay, so let's jump to their first bomb. And I'm not getting very far tonight because I'm a little less organized, but I hope you're finding this interesting. Okay, so Weatherman's first bomb, a small one that destroyed the 10-foot bronze statue of a policeman in Haymarket Square, site of the violent 1886 labor rally in which 11 people, 7 of them policemen, were killed. So we told that story, right? The Haymarket Square. And so they are very aware of that. And they set off a bomb there to destroy the policeman statue because, right, they're attacking policemen. That's one of the big targets of their attack. And they want to tie themselves back to that, the political violence of the Haymarket affair. Okay, and then the police put them down in Chicago. And also, nobody really showed up for the Days of Rage. They thought this was going to be they were going to have a lot of people, and there weren't that many people, and the Chicago police really beat them down. They didn't have much patience with them. And so John Lerner says the Days of Rage was really a shock to us, that nobody came but us. We didn't step back and take a sober view of it, like maybe we aren't on the verge of a revolution because nobody seems to have our backs here. We took a reactive view, which was, well, if we're the only people who will do this, it's us against the world. And after that, it was. So, around the end of 1969, they decided to go underground. And so the Weathermen, a faction who had briefly taken over the SDS and then sort of destroyed it, became the Weather Underground. So to go underground meant to free themselves up from, ideally, from consequences, right? That they could commit violence and then disappear. And they wouldn't have jobs to lose. They wouldn't have a life on the line, their normal life. They would just give up their normal life so they could pursue political action. Yeah, so let me share a little bit about that moment. In a 2011 interview for this book, by the way, that's one of the reasons this book is just phenomenal. Some of these things that had happened, people didn't know how it was done or who did it, for decades and decades. And this guy got a lot of these people to talk and was able to reveal a lot that literally no one knew except the people involved for 40 years or whatever. So in a 2011 interview for this book, Rudd remembered being stunned by the sudden shift in strategy. They had mused about going underground for months, every self-styled revolutionary had, but Rudd had never truly believed they would go through with it. Just as startling, he says, was how the message was delivered, by Bernadine Dorn, with preternatural cool, as if she were suggesting we go for supper. As Rudd recalled it, Dorn said, "We've learned from Che that the only way to make a revolution is to actually begin armed struggle. This is what we've been waiting for. The next step after the national action, Days of Rage, is to move to a higher level of struggle to build the underground. Street violence is an unsustainable tactic. It makes us too vulnerable and costs too much. We've got to be able to work clandestinely. And so Rudd couldn't believe it. They were planning to initiate actual violence, actual bombings, actual sabotage. It was surreal. And then Bernardine Dorn, along with JJ, Jeff Jones, and Terry Robbins, took over the organization, and everybody else was sort of put under them. Okay, let me get one thing ready so I can see how long I have. Okay, I think I have a little bit more time. Okay, now, so going into 1970 then, they decided to start doing some bombings. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to share this moment. Where was this? It was one of their gatherings. Oh yeah, New Year's, held in the days between Christmas 1969 and New Year's 1970, billed as the National War Council, or Wargasm. It was the pep rally from hell, a 5-day orgy of violent rhetoric intended to set the stage for the underground revolution the leadership was now ready to begin. Now, remember that Charles Manson had been doing, in his eyes, a political action. Well, Bernardine Dorn picked up on that, right? It was Dorn's speech that people would talk about for years to come. For once, she shed her cool facade and practically screamed for the crowd to avenge the murder of Fred Hampton, I think a Black Panther, by bringing violence and chaos, writ large or small, to white America. She told a story of an airline flight where she claimed she and JJ had run down the aisle stealing food from the other passengers' trays. That's what we're about, she shouted, being crazy motherfuckers and scaring the shit out of honky America. She climaxed by heaping praise on the wild-eyed Charles Manson for his cult's murders, including that of Sharon Tate and Tate's unborn baby. Dig it, she famously cried. First they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the same room with them. They even shoved a fork into the victim's stomach. Wild. Soon everyone in the hall was raising their hands in 4-finger salutes, signifying the fork shoved into the pregnant Sharon Tate's belly. These are nice people. Okay, so I'm a little unsure if I'm going to keep going further into the book. I hope this is, I'm a little more scattered this time than usual. I hope it's okay. Let's make sure I'm caught up on chats, and then I might cover a little bit more in the time I have left before I'll go with my wife. So Robert Emmett Walsh, hey, I know this is off topic, but I just wanted to let you know about an IRL infinite money glitch I found. Just do the opposite of whatever Jim Cramer says. That's the glitch in the simulation, right? Right, Robert. Thank you. Very funny. Okay, and then let's look on. That's a subscribe star tip, which is the best way to send money. But let's also look here. Yeah, so Lady of Shalott sends into a seminal book in unpacking where this came from is Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by Dave McGowan. It delves into the dark heart of the hippie dream. I did not know about that. And then, as I already read, she said these people would be working for Soros now. Some of them may literally be working for Soros. A number of them are still alive. Bernardine Dorn is still alive, for example. And she's married to Bill Ayers. And he's still alive as well. Okay, so I think, let me see where my wife is. Yeah, oh yeah, I've got some time. Okay, let's cover a little more. So chapter 4 is titled, As to Killing People, We Were Prepared to Do That. And this covers the Weathermen from January to March 1970. What I'd really like to get to is the part that I hinted at. The part that felt a little, suddenly I felt like, whoa, a little more connected to this than I expected in a certain kind of a way. So they're doing their go underground thing, get blank birth certificates, or a big one they like to do was dead babies. They'd search old newspapers for a child who had died very young, walk around in remote cemeteries in search of infant graves dated around the time they were born, right? And so they would use the birth certificates then to turn it into ID, right? Fake ID. So they were getting into the mechanics of living underground, creating fake identities, and so forth. Um, so let's see. Attacking police. They didn't actually do that. Oh yeah, okay. So they had three Weatherman groups by the first week of February 1970. One in San Francisco, one grouping in San Francisco, one in the Midwest, and one in New York. Um, and what was going to come next was bombings. And the three groups acted independently, each one with a field marshal, Bill Ayers in the Midwest, Howie Machtinger in San Francisco, and key name here, Terry Robbins in New York. And they each independently made their plan. And I'm going to skip to there was a Berkeley bombing, but they didn't take credit for it, and so it wasn't thought of as a Weatherman thing. There were a lot of bombings going on at the time. He said, yeah, there were so many bombings that winter. In just the 2-week period before and afterward, from February 6th to February 21st, 1970, there were 17 incidents of significant radical violence in the United States, including 2 bombings by a Puerto Rican independence group in New York on February 9th, a firebombing in Ypsilanti, Michigan on February 11th, the bombing of a police station in Danbury, Connecticut that injured 23 people on February 13th, another set of bombings in Berkeley, believed to be the work of black militants, on February 16th, and sundry other bombings in Hartford, Boston, and Maryland. So this was like happening all the time. I was reading, where is it? Somewhere he says people would just be like, oh, there's another bombing. So what? Like, where's that? It just people were like numb to it at that time. Yeah, here we go. I'll read that quote I read in my marketing from retired FBI agent Max Noel. People have completely forgotten that in 1972 we had over 1,900 domestic bombings in the United States. People don't want to listen to that. They can't believe it. One bombing now and everyone gets excited. In 1972, it was every day. Buildings getting bombed, policemen getting killed. It was commonplace. I've had trouble absorbing all this because I was actually alive at the time. I was little, but you'd think I would have heard more about all the violence that was going on when I was a little kid, and I don't remember hearing that much about it. I don't remember hearing anything about it, frankly. Okay, so let me jump forward to the part I really want to talk about. Yeah, okay, and then the last one of the 3 groups to mobilize was Terry Robbins with the New York Collective. Partially because he was having a jail sentence following a demonstration. He didn't get to Manhattan until late January. The California and Midwestern groups were, well into their planning stages. So he said, well, he figured I'm going to be last, but I'm going to really make it happen, And so he was with, his girlfriend at the time was Kathy Wilkerson. And so they went and grabbed some explosives. Let's see, they tossed a bomb at a patrol car outside the New York Police Department's Charles Street precinct. A second blew up in the street nearby. Neither caused any damage. Then more were thrown at Navy and Army recruitment booths near Brooklyn College. A fifth ignited on the steps of the Columbia University Law Library. Then remember the Panther 21, right? Conspiracy trial. Terry Robbins led a group into the neighborhood at the northern tip of Manhattan to the red brick home of John Murtaugh, the judge overseeing the Panther 21 trial. Murtaugh was asleep inside with his wife and 3 children. Before placing the bombs, the group scrawled "Free the Panther 21" and "The Viet Cong have won" on the sidewalk. And they placed 3 shopping bags containing Molotov cocktails beside the front door, on a window ledge, and beneath the car in the garage. All 3 went off at 4:30 a.m., blowing out 2 of the home's windows and scorching the car. So it got headlines, but their role went unreported. They didn't send a communique to explain what it was about. So that wasn't very exciting. So he decided, we got to do something better than that. And so Kathy Wilkerson got a hold of a townhouse from her father and stepmother's townhouse, and she convinced them, they were kind of estranged, but she convinced them that she was sick, she needed a place to be while they were out of town. And so they went there to hide and build the bomb. Terry Robbins worked, I'll cut to the chase, Terry Robbins worked on the bomb down in the basement, and he made a mistake and blew up the townhouse and himself. And so this happened, let's see, Friday, March 6th, I believe. Yeah, their plan was to bomb a Fort Dix dance, so a military dance. Terry Robbins and Diana Auten disappeared into the sub-basement to finish building the bombs. Let's see. Anyway, there were 5 in the townhouse when the bomb that Terry Robbins was working on went off, and it was quite a big bomb. It absolutely destroyed this townhouse, and it was right next to the home of Dustin Hoffman. Yeah, it says the force of it blew a massive hole in the wall of an adjoining building, which happened to house an apartment occupied by the actor Dustin Hoffman and his wife. Hoffman's desk fell into the hole behind the house. The blast knocked an officer off his feet. Wilkerson and Bowden, the 2 women, they actually survived. Wilkerson was in blue jeans. Her blouse had been blown off. Bowden was completely nude. Somebody came out, helped them, and then they quietly went out a back door and disappeared. But the other 3 were destroyed. So here's what the personal moment, and then I should go. I knew about this. This is one of the famous things, right? The blowing up of the townhouse. I knew about this, but what I didn't know, what I didn't piece together until reading this book, is that I was there. I mean, I was in, I'm in St. Louis, right? I've been in St. Louis since I was 1, but when I was the first half of 1970, I was in New York. As I've often shared, my father was trained to be a missionary to the Jews by Moishe Rosen, who went on to found Jews for Jesus. Well, that training happened in New York in the first half of 1970. So it just, I don't know, I guess it's meaningless. It just gave me a little chill. I'm reading the book and I'm like, wait a second. I was there with my parents. I think we lived in Queens, so we weren't, this was in, what's it called? That fancy neighborhood. Or, well, it was fancy at the time, I guess. Greenwich Village. It was a Greenwich Village townhouse, if I remember correctly, or near Greenwich Village. Okay, so I'll stop there. That had a big impact because right out of the gate, when they're first starting to do this stuff, the they blow themselves. Three of them, one of them being a key leader, blows themselves up, and that kind of throws them for a loop. They're just getting started here at the beginning of 1970 on this new revolutionary action, and they blow themselves up. Okay, so I'll just check to see if there's any other things, and we'll continue in 2 weeks, hopefully. The holiday plans could interfere, but that'll be certainly the next episode that isn't an Econ Minis will be to continue through the Days of Rage, which, by the way, finding out about this book and buying it and looking at it inspired me to do this whole series on left-wing terror. I thought, I do want to talk about Yeah. Well, Vulpes Persona says there my dad was proselytizing Dustin Hoffman when all of a sudden, yeah. um, yeah. Virtual Beatnik says that's far out, Radlib. I was young enough that people would say far out, sir, when I was a kid. I don't know if I've ever said it, but people around me would say it. And anyway, so this inspired the whole series on oh, correction, West 11th Street. Wait, what is she talking about? West 13th Street. Oh, she's talking about where it happened. Okay. Anyway, or sorry, whoever that is. Yeah. So the Left Wing Terror series was inspired by Days of Rage, but I just didn't want it to be so American centric, and I didn't want it to be without some better context. I wanted us to look at left wing terror over the last century, see some of the patterns. One we don't see, as far as I've seen so far, is an attack on Christians, which we often saw, right, with the Bolsheviks, with the Spanish Civil War, and a number of other cases. I don't remember Christians being particularly targeted, though I'll have to pay careful attention as I finish the rest of the book. It was really this racial politics, right? That's really the theme we're going to see with the Weather Underground, and then eventually with the didn't get to it today, though I think my marketing promise didn't. Oops, sorry. Tune in next time, and we will get to the Black Liberation Army, where it gets. That's the thing. Last night I was reading the Black Liberation Army stuff section of the book, and I had to, stop and like be around people because it was getting so gruesome and dark. I was starting to feel like, whoa, I gotta just stop for a little bit and take a break. It's really terrible stuff. Okay, so we'll continue with this. I think some of the people in the chat know about some of these things, which is impressive. I knew very little about this, I have to say. I knew there was a thing called the Weather Underground. I knew about a townhouse blowing up. I didn't know that they did a lot of other stuff that was pretty significant in terms of bombings. And that, Sam Melville sparked them, and then they in turn sparked further radical action, which costs people their lives, a lot of people their lives. So, yeah, thanks, Lady of Shalot. She says, loving these streams. This is a real area of interest for me. Yeah, I feel like, the radicals took over, right? They saw themselves as on the fringes, and now they're in charge. I mean, I think Clinton commuted the sentences, or what do you call it? Pardoned. He pardoned like some of these terrorists, these left-wing terrorists and stuff. And so, they're really, they're not on the fringes anymore. They're as we've seen, as we experience all the time, they're really in the position. They've taken over the institutions at this point. The long march through the institutions wasn't that long. I mean, we go from 1970 to, it's been 50 years, and like they're all over everything. And so, I guess I don't think left-wing terrorism is a great thing. It was bad in all these other countries, and it was bad in America, and we'll find out more next time. Okay, thank you for super chats and subscribe star tips, and we will see you next week, hopefully with Nikon Minis with Black Horse. Give us a little break before we dive back into violence and left-wing commie action, right? Okay, thank you. Talk to you later. Bye.